Hello all, Rick here with a video on the most common form of travel in the Star Trek universe, aside from impulse. And walking, probably. That of warp drive. So, this video will explore how warp works in the show, followed by its limitations and shortcomings before settling on the issues within the show itself. Warp drive is often the easiest form of FTL travel that most cultures develop, with warp 1 being equal to the speed of light and factors over this being even faster. It accomplishes this without breaking the laws of general relativity that state that an object with any mass needs exponentially more energy to propel it the closer it gets to the speed of light. The journey to achieving warp is different for every species. Humans discovered it after the experimentation from Zephram Cochrane. The Klingons reputedly stole it from the Herc during the time of Kahless, and the Vulcans developed it soon after their falling out with the Romulans. So, effectively, warp is based on the principle of folding space-time and creating a localized warp bubble around the ship. This condenses space before the vessel, before expanding it behind it, literally rippling the fabric of reality, hence the name warp, and the strength of this field is measured in millicochranes. This would not be achievable without the effect of subspace, which is a layer of reality that exists beyond, or below, however you want to phrase it, regular space-time. In this realm, physics get a little squiffy and have their own rule set, which is used to explain away many of the issues that a real warp drive would potentially face. In reality, the warp drive was created for Star Trek, based on the notion that space-time is malleable, but it had little development behind it until a physicist named Miguel Alcubierre created the concept for a drive that would function as I just described, inspired by Star Trek. Star Trek then adopted this theory as the model on which to base its own warp drive, a great example of science fiction inspiring real developments, and then vice versa. Development and theories continue to explore and evolve this idea, and Star Trek will likely continue to adapt them into its own science fiction as more discoveries are made. But for now, back to the in-universe warp drive. The warp bubble itself can be generated by a number of technologies, but the most common by far is the use of warp nacelles. These are lined with warp coils that produce a warp field in a similar way as electromagnets forming a magnetic field. The energy needed to create such a powerful space-bending effect is not insubstantial, and the biggest hurdle for most societies to cross. Again, the most common method of producing energy is from a warp core, where matter and antimatter are annihilated to produce energy. The majority of technologies also rely on the crystal dilithium to regulate this reaction because of its strange subspace properties. Over the generations, warp travel has been refined constantly, leading to a bit of confusion and a complete overhaul of the Federation warp scale. From the invention of warp drive in 2063 up to an unspecified date around the turn of the 24th century, Starfleet was operating on a warp scale without an identifiable limit. Basically, if a new speed was achieved, it was designated a new factor of warp. While warp 1 was the speed of light, subsequent factors were a little vaguer, and these increases were not at equal intervals, so warp 2 was not twice the speed of light, but designated by some other limit. The fact that this warp scale had no upper limit was reflective of the developing science of the time. The full potential of warp had not been established, so none was set. During the film era, around the 2280s, the warp scale was altered with the ever-increasing speeds being achieved, and warp factor 10 was designated instantaneous travel, where a vessel could arrive at any point in an instant, theoretically occupying every point in space-time at once, with 10 being the new capstone. The existing warp scale was crammed into the new one, but that meant that the old warp factors had new values, so the old TOS era warp 7 is slower than the newer TNG era warp 7. This revamp comes with its own shortcomings, however. While it identified an absolute limit for warp speeds, infinite velocity, it meant that between warp 9 and 10 there are an infinite number of exponential factors that could be achieved, which is increasingly becoming reflected by things like warp 9.1, 9.6, 9.9, 9.975, and so on, inching ever closer to warp 10 but never reaching the elusive infinity speed, except of that one episode of Voyager. Some suspect that the catalyst for this change was the USS Excelsior NX-2000, as it was a transwarp prototype that was to revolutionise warp travel. We see it sabotaged in the film by Scotty, but what if it was eventually successful and led to a substantial increase in speeds, prompting Starfleet to redesign its entire warp scale? With Starfleet developing higher and higher warp factors, they are soon to face an issue of a ridiculous number of 9s after a decimal point, because they cannot say 10 without it being effective teleportation. In order to get around this, I would propose that warp 9 through to 9.9 remain as they are, but then introduce a new system of transwarp that starts at transwarp 1, and is one factor higher than 9.9. You clearly get the impression that you have exceeded the previous warp factor, but it's a more cohesive way to say transwarp 3 than to say warp 9.9999874. This way too, regular old warp 10 can still mean instant travel. Aside from this imposed issue with warp speeds, there is another more notable side effect. That is that repeated warp travel over a certain area can damage subspace, causing a breakdown between subspace and regular space, forming an area of extreme turbulence. This was discovered in 2370, and the Federation imposed a warp speed limit on all its vessels until a workaround could be discovered, breaking the limit only with authorization. In Apocrypha, this is one of the reasons for the sleeker profiles of starships we started to see around this time, as it reduced the subspace profile and therefore damage with a less brute force approach to higher warp factors. Other limiting factors on warp includes the availability of energy sources such as the deuterium for a warp core, the quality of dilithium, subspace turbulence or drag, and other environmental hurdles. Additionally, in an area where there is no subspace, such as an area destroyed by omega molecules, then a warp bubble cannot form, nor any FTL messages be sent. Additionally, an improperly balanced warp system can lead to all sorts of errors, some of which will simply result in the destruction of the vessel. But as you are literally bending space, other mistakes can occur, such as forming a wormhole or accelerating to a point that the ship cannot handle. There are a number of other systems too that revolve around warp, such as the deflector dish, which projects a field before the vessel that pushes aside small debris and space dust. Otherwise, a ship travelling at multiple times the speed of light, hitting a speck of dust, would most likely blow apart that ship, and the speck of dust wouldn't fare too well either. Out of universe, the shows are deliberately vague as to the exact speeds and distances covered with warp drive, so as to cover up any inconsistencies. It is for this reason too that we don't see any canon maps with exacting measurements, because with this veil, writers can say that it's only X days to Y at warp 8, and there are no concrete figures to deny this outright as inaccurate, which may otherwise get in the way of the narrative of the week. So, thank you for watching my breakdown of Warp Drive, my nitpicks and its limitations both in-universe and out of. I've been Rick, and I'll see you next time for another sci-fi video. Until then, thanks again, and engage.